all for coming. It's cold and it's winter, but the one thing that I was thinking of on the way here was that although there's a lot of trepidation and fear about the closing of the plant and what it will do to the tax base and jobs and all of those things, the Eagles won. So underdogs do well when everybody comes together. Patriots didn't have the year that they were hoping for. So I think that that is a good sign and a good omen for the people in these communities that the potential is here. It's getting the right people to talk to each other and find common ground. And unfortunately, or maybe even fortunately, there's been a bunch of clashing. So there are the environmentalists, there are the people at labor, there are the people in government, there are the people in business. And everybody has a very clear agenda of what they're looking for, and in not too many places do those things cross. And because they don't cross, the process is getting slower and slower, and people are getting more nervous and more nervous. And the nervous energy, you know, positive stress versus negative stress. So maybe there is some potential there. There are things that have not been discussed publicly in the two task forces. For those of you who don't know, there are two task forces. There's a state task force and a local task force to deal with the closing of Indian Point and the ramifications thereof. The local task force looks at things in one way, the state task force looks at things in the other way. So there is a fund at the state level for emergencies, when towns or villages or communities become under duress. And that has X amount of billions of dollars in it, and that's for the entire state. Now, there is a question of how much money that's in that fund can then be pulled in for these communities to help over the hurdle of the plant closing. Now, of course, we all know that the first reactor closes in 2020, the second one in 2021, and then the decommissioning begins. So there's an awful lot of lead time to do some things and not anywhere near enough lead time to do other things. A lot of people have talked about economic development and the need to replace what you have for the tax rolls. And that will be probably very difficult in this short window of time, but not impossible. But once again, it will take government, the business sector, the unions, and everybody else working together in a much more agreeable fashion than just sitting and shaking their heads yes, and then wondering when someone else is going to do something. So right now, on the table, we have something that's really interesting. The governor had said that there is going to be a $2 surcharge on every single New York's payer of electricity for 12 years. And that money, which is supposed to in 12 years reach $7.6 billion, will go to sustain 3 nuclear plants in upstate New York. That's because those plants are not so healthy either. And they need extra funds in order to stay operational. I don't know if at the end of that 12 years they're supposed to close and do to their communities what this is going to do to this community, or what the Vermont plant did in Vermont, or some of the other plants have done in other communities around the country. But the fact is that if we are paying that kind of money, $2 every month for 12 years, if you add in the taxpayer or the ratepayer and the businesses in Westchester County alone, you will get up to somewhere in the vicinity of over $1 billion. Now just imagine if that $1 billion was redirected to the communities that will suffer the most, and over 12 years getting possibly less and less each year as economic development and other things happen, that money was directed here to help with that transition. That would allow for economic development. That would allow for changes. But it's going to take the communities themselves and the neighbors and others to come together and say, Governor, we're not going to fight you on the $2, but we're going to say that some of that $2 out of that $7.6 billion is going to be redirected our way. 3 plants in upstate are fine, but we want help here to make the transition. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we hear a lot about the need for re-educating the workforce. Now, a good portion of that workforce is based in Putnam and Dutchess County. So, although there are people who work in the plant from here, absolutely true, there are numbers of people, 400 or 500 or 600, that work outside of Westchester. So, where are they going to get retrained? How are they going to get retrained? On the task forces, you will not find anybody representing the Westchester Community College or Dutchess Community College. In many instances, those kinds of jobs would go through a community college for those kinds of programs. They're not included. So I think that to not have educators or administrators at the table when you're looking to do things, if you bring them on at the end, they're not part of the process. They should have been there from the beginning. And you needed the person in Dutchess to help the people in Putnam and in Dutchess, and you need the person from Westchester in order to have Westchester. The other thing that concerned me was that local representation, you've got the town supervisor of Cortland, you've got the mayor of Buchanan, you've got other local legislators on these task forces, both of them. But who do you have representing the people from Putnam and Dutchess? So if you brought those legislators down, towns and villages where they have a concentration of the workforce, when you go to Albany, when you go to Washington and ask for money, it's not just one community asking for that. Now you've got multiple counties asking for that kind of support. And that kind of lobbying, therefore, makes a huge difference in the eyes of legislators, because now it's not a Westchester problem. Now it's a problem that also reaches into other counties, and counties that share a lot of the same commonalities with the northern tier, where there's a lot of senators and a lot of assembly members. So they relate to the members from Dutchess, and they relate to the members from Putnam. They may not relate as well all the time to people who come from the wealthy county down south. So by mixing and matching, by really thinking on a broad scale, you change the dynamic, you change the discussion, you change the argument. So what could be the kinds of things that would make a difference here? Obviously, you're not going to replace a nuclear reactor with another nuclear reactor. And it's the process that is sort of disconcerting, because on day one, when they decided the plant was closing down, and it doesn't really matter at this point who decided to close the plant, whether it was Entergy, whether it was pressure from the governor, whatever it was, the reality is the plant is closing. Entergy would have closed it at some point, because every nuclear plant closes at some point. You can see that in Europe. You can see that in other parts of the United States. The plants close. They only have a certain lifespan. Why there was no plan in place for when that would happen is what we really should be asking. Maybe it's a little late to ask it now, because now there are bigger problems, but that's the question. So, being that this has happened before, the Yankee plant in Vermont, other plants in other parts of the country, there's a plant that closed down recently in Florida that caused the same kind of problems. This is not unique. So we need to really pay attention to what these communities did and did not do. We can't spend a lot of time trying to reinvent the wheel, because the wheel is already coming off. So how do we make sure that that wheel stays on? How do we make sure that that wheel does what it's supposed to do? And how do we move forward so people don't get hurt? And if we look at it from that perspective, the first perspective is, how do we prevent as many people as possible so that they don't get hurt? So we understand that who represents workers? Well, the unions represent the workers. So how do we, even though the unions are on the task force, what's their role? And how are they facilitated in doing that better? Okay, that's one thing. Government is affected. The schools are affected. That's part of the governmental operation, and a big part of this problem is the Henrik Hudson school system, which potentially will lose a third of its budget. What are the things that can be done to find $20 million, $22 million a year? And what can the community absorb, and what is unfair for it to absorb? Because when people bought houses here, when people came and understood what their property tax responsibility was going to be, they didn't bargain on all of a sudden it doubling or tripling over the next few months or years. So those people, once again, how do we help? How do we facilitate? How do we bring the right people to the table so that those things can be discussed honestly and straightforwardly? Right now, looking for eternal money from Albany with a $4 billion deficit at the state level now, looking to Washington where they're looking to cut as much as humanly possible. Those are not long-term options. Looking at the industry is a closing down industry, not a growth industry. We're seeing plants close far more than they're opening across the country, around the world. France is closing down their nuclear plants. Germany, Japan, they're all closing down, they're not opening. So yes, there are a few places like in Africa where they do open them, but in far smaller numbers than when that industry burst on the scene. I met with numbers of people before deciding to do this, simply because I know that it is as contentious as it is, with each group really looking out for how I will survive, not necessarily how I'll do better than the next guy, but how am I just going to keep my nose above water. And I was remembering back in 1990, which was 4 years, I believe, after Chernobyl, I was working in what was then the Soviet Union on the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so I was in Kiev, and Kiev was 85 miles from Chernobyl. And here it was 4 years later, and every day workers would get on the roofs of the government officials' homes and hose them down. 4 years later. And that water would run down because they got to live on the hill. As good government officials do, they live on the hill. And that water would run down, and 6 years later, women giving birth that lived at the bottom of the hill were still having children with deformities. And so those kinds of things just made me nervous. It doesn't mean that the industry in the United States is not safe. It doesn't mean the industry in Germany wasn't safe. But we know that for every trade-off on one thing, there's a trade-off for something else. So I come to it with that in mind, since I was fortunate enough, I guess, to get to sit in at the UN meeting in Kiev on the aftermath of Chernobyl. And unlike here, nobody is going to have to be moved out, and you're not going to have wolves and mice running around that are radioactive and glow in the dark, which has happened over there. But even 85 miles away in a major metropolis, what is now a nation's capital, there are still effects from then. I still remember I was in my hotel and they said, don't eat these vegetables. They were grown on the other side of the line. Being a vegetarian, that presented some very unique problems. Don't eat this bread. The wheat came from over there. So we had to it took time to even understand all the machinations of what was going on. Here, clearly it's different, and thank goodness it's different. So that's a problem we do not have to face. But what are the kinds of things that could happen now? So once again, I put on my thinking hat, and I remember what I was doing in Egypt. I've gotten to work in strange places. But I was in Egypt during the Arab Spring, and one of the things that we were looking at was, with this growing trend around the world of people doing contract work and people becoming independent business owners, which is a growing trend. You'd see more people that are driving Lyfts and driving Ubers and doing all kinds of jobs in order to create a composite that allows them to live. So in Egypt, what we looked at was, in Alexandria, Egypt, it's a tourist place. People from all over the Middle East in particular come there because it's right on the water, and there are big hotels, and there are lots of restaurants. And I noticed there was tremendous amount of waste. And we started to look at what people did. And a lot of these restaurants and hotels, they just threw the stuff out, right into the street. And then there were other people who would come by and sweep it up and try to collect it for sometimes personal use, sometimes for other. And we thought, what would happen if we created one of the world's great composting companies that made organic fertilizer to replenish the soil along the Nile River? And to make sure that it stayed as a capitalist venture, we understood that some of the companies that we'd create would buy out the weaker companies. But now, to prevent people from falling back into poverty, we would also create a marketing firm. And we would train those people how to work in marketing and public relations. So instead of falling backwards, they all would have shares in the sales company, the marketing company, and the public relations firm. So they would own shares, they would move up, or at least their children would move up, and then we would have international sales and international trade. So there would be tiers of different companies that would allow those who bought out everybody at the collection stage, who also have shares in these other companies, and it would create an entire different version of a capitalistic enterprise based on both need and making sure that people moved up rather than moved back. So when you think about what's going on in the country today, I met with somebody on Saturday who just sold their solar business. They employed 3,000 people, and they sold it for over $1 billion. And he said, you do realize that in the renewables and reusables and clean energy, we're bringing on anywhere between 230 and 300,000 people a year into this industry. So every 6 months, every 3 months, depending, we are replacing the entire workforce that works in coal. There are only 40,000 Americans that work in coal. There are now a few million that are working in renewables. Here we have a perfect opportunity, maybe even the perfect storm, for creating a center out of New York State for renewable energy. You could have an institute that's tied in with the community colleges. You could have manufacturing. You've got the trains, you've got some roadways, you've got a lot of the infrastructure that's already here, and you could be doing testing on that energy supply because you already have the lines that can take that energy from what exists now at Indian Point and send it everywhere to see how it works, how effective it is, and where it can go. And that gives you also the kind of industry, the kind of infrastructure that potentially allows you to sell not only across the United States, but around the world. And as more and more companies that are in the house manufacturing and all of those kinds of things are looking for ways to save energy, to conserve, and to use cleaner energy, there's a big business there. There's a really big business there. And it's not dependent, potentially, on just one employer. I think that people have learned a lesson. I certainly know that I did, just watching what's going on here. Being dependent on one company, being dependent on one source, it's like those old days when people lived in the coal mining towns, or when you lived in Hollywood and that was the only business in town. When that business doesn't want you anymore, or when that business is finished with you, you're in big trouble. And diversification, whether it's in your investments, whether it's in job opportunities, whether it's in housing, it's very important to look at strategies that bring multiple things in so that you're never ever in a situation where you're owned by the company that pays your taxes. So I will talk for just a few more minutes and then open it up because we do have to be out of here before 8 o'clock. So from my perspective, the best thing that we can do, one, is make sure that the right people in addition to the right people who are already on the task forces, are on the task forces, so that we're preparing for what must happen, and preparing now rather than waiting for someone else to come up with a plan. Two, one of the things that I had suggested to the superintendent of schools, which I think they're going to do now, is to organize both trips to Albany and to Washington, to meet with legislators while they're in session, while they're there, and ask what can be done. Three, I would go to the nuclear industry. They have trade groups, they have all kinds of industry organizations, and see how and where they might be able to be helpful. And four, start thinking in terms of what is the future, because putting a Band-Aid on this is not going to work. It's just not going to work. And using and relying on political machines that are in place that do a lot of talking but haven't produced any action is not going to make you feel better when you go to bed at night. So when a person on that task force stands up and asks what is everybody else doing, we collectively as citizens should be asking them what specifically are they doing. These are the kinds of things where no one person alone is ever going to make a difference. But collectively, when people come together, when people share a conviction and a common cause, things change. And we saw that in the 2017 elections, where people got angry at what they saw and they changed government. We don't know what the outcome will be, it's still too soon. But town after town after town changed many of their local officials. And that's because people got together, and people knocked on doors, and people got angry. Well, when you channel that anger in the right way, you make progress. And this morning, every Monday morning, I send out a press document. It's not really a press release because it's not announcing something or saying something that happened. And the one that I did this morning was on John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. And that was 57 years ago, almost today, because it was January 20th. January 20th, 1961. And I'm sure that many of you in this room either remember it or heard, his most famous question, which was, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I think that that holds true in this. Don't look for others. Tell others what you can do to make it better. If we rely and we wait for everybody else, we won't achieve the great potential that we all have. And I know, from traveling around these communities, I know from listening to people and reading what people are saying and doing, that the potential in these communities is enormous. The talent of the people, the commitment to the communities, the commitment to the schools there's nothing at all that limits it. But it means coming together, it means organizing, it means taking a stand, and it means being willing to do what needs to be done in order to make it happen. And I guess we have to put the chairs away, but then we can talk outside the building.